For years, the smartphone world has felt completely locked down. On one side, you have Apple controlling every single detail of iOS, from what apps can exist to how your device can be repaired. On the other side, you have Android, which technically started as open source, but slowly became dominated by massive corporations, Google services, app tracking, data collection, and manufacturers filling phones with unwanted software. Most people accepted this as normal because there didn't seem to be any real alternative. But in 2025, something unexpected is happening. Linux phones are no longer just weird experimental devices for developers hiding in internet forums. They are becoming real products with growing communities, improving hardware, and operating systems that are evolving faster than many expected. Suddenly, people are asking a serious question that sounded impossible just a few years ago. What if the future of smartphones is no longer controlled by Apple or Google? What if the next big mobile revolution comes from open source Linux systems built by communities instead of giant corporations? The idea of a Linux phone is actually much older than most people realize. Long before Android became dominant, many developers dreamed about creating a truly open mobile operating system where users controlled everything. The problem was always hardware support, app compatibility, and performance. Smartphones became more complex every year, and only huge companies had enough resources to optimize software for mobile devices. That allowed Android and iOS to completely dominate the market for more than a decade. But now the technology landscape is changing. Modern Linux distributions have become lighter, faster, and more touch-friendly. Open source mobile interfaces have improved dramatically. New chipsets are becoming easier to support. And perhaps most importantly, millions of people are becoming increasingly uncomfortable with the amount of surveillance and ecosystem lock-in that exists inside mainstream smartphones. People are tired of feeling like they rent their own devices instead of owning them. One of the biggest reasons Linux phones are gaining attention in 2025 is privacy. Every major smartphone company collects enormous amounts of user data. Location tracking, app behavior, search history, voice recordings, contacts, and usage patterns are constantly analyzed. Even when companies claim data is anonymized, users are realizing how much personal information flows through their devices every day. Linux phones promise something radically different. Because many Linux mobile operating systems are fully open source, users can actually inspect the code, remove unwanted services, and customize exactly what runs on their phones. Instead of hidden background processes reporting data to corporations, Linux phones focus on transparency and user control. That idea is becoming extremely attractive in a world where digital privacy feels like it disappears more every year. Another reason this movement matters is repairability and ownership. Modern smartphones are increasingly difficult to repair. Batteries are glued down, components are serialized, and manufacturers sometimes restrict third-party repairs through software locks. Linux phone communities are pushing in the opposite direction. Many Linux-based devices encourage modularity, user-replaceable parts, and long-term software support. Some companies building Linux phones are openly supporting repair culture instead of fighting against it. That changes the relationship people have with their technology. Instead of replacing phones every 2 or 3 years, users can potentially maintain devices for much longer. In a time when electronic waste is becoming a massive global issue, this approach feels more sustainable and consumer-friendly than the upgrade cycles pushed by mainstream brands. What makes 2025 especially important is that Linux mobile software is finally becoming usable for normal people, instead of only developers. A few years ago, Linux phones were exciting but frustrating. Basic features like cameras, GPS, calling stability, or battery optimization often barely worked. But today, distributions like postmarketOS, Ubuntu Touch, Mobian, and PureOS are evolving rapidly. Mobile Linux interfaces now support smoother gestures, app stores, adaptive layouts, improved notifications, and better hardware compatibility. The experience still isn't perfect compared to polished Android or iOS devices, but the gap is shrinking much faster than many analysts predicted. Every year, Linux phones become less experimental and more practical for everyday tasks like messaging, browsing, video streaming, navigation, and productivity. One massive advantage Linux phones have is freedom from ecosystem restrictions. Apple's ecosystem is famous for locking users into its services and accessories. Android manufacturers do similar things through cloud services, proprietary app stores, and custom software layers. Linux phones break away from that model entirely. Users can choose different desktop environments, install alternative software repositories, customize system behavior, and even replace the operating system entirely without needing corporate approval. That level of freedom is incredibly appealing to tech enthusiasts, developers, privacy advocates, and power users who want complete control over their devices. In many ways, Linux phones represent the original spirit of computing before ecosystems became heavily controlled and monetized. The hardware side is also evolving faster than expected. Early Linux phones struggled because manufacturers were unwilling to support open source drivers and documentation, but several companies in 2025 are specifically targeting Linux enthusiasts with hardware designed for openness and compatibility. Devices from companies like Pine64 and Purism helped establish the foundation, while newer projects are experimenting with better processors, improved displays, stronger battery life, and hardware kill switches for cameras and microphones. Hardware kill switches sound simple, but they symbolize the philosophy behind Linux phones. Instead of asking users to trust software privacy settings, these devices sometimes allow users to physically disconnect sensitive hardware. That creates a level of confidence mainstream phones rarely provide. Another fascinating development is convergence. Linux phones are starting to blur the line between smartphones and desktop computers. Because many Linux mobile operating systems are built on desktop Linux foundations, some devices can connect to monitors, keyboards, and mice to function almost like full PCs. Imagine carrying a smartphone in your pocket that transforms into a desktop workstation when plugged into a screen. Android tried limited versions of this idea, but Linux systems may ultimately handle it more naturally because they already share deep compatibility with traditional desktop software. For students, programmers, travelers, and remote workers, this could completely redefine portable computing over the next decade. App support remains one of the biggest challenges, but even this area is changing rapidly. For years, critics argued Linux phones could never succeed because users depend on apps built for Android and iOS ecosystems. The criticism still has truth behind it, but developers are finding creative solutions. Web apps have become far more powerful than before. Progressive web applications can now replicate many native app experiences. Compatibility layers are improving. Open source alternatives to mainstream apps continue expanding. Messaging platforms, browsers, office tools, media players, and productivity software already function surprisingly well on Linux mobile systems. While gaming and certain commercial apps still lag behind, the dependency on traditional app stores is slowly weakening as cloud services and browser-based tools improve. What really worries Apple and Google is not immediate market share loss. Linux phones are not going to dominate global smartphone sales overnight. The real threat is ideological. Linux phones challenge the entire assumption that smartphones must be tightly controlled ecosystems operated by trillion-dollar corporations. They prove another path is possible. If Linux phones continue improving, they could pressure mainstream companies to become more transparent, more repair-friendly, and less restrictive. Even a relatively small but passionate Linux phone community can influence the direction of the broader industry. We already saw similar things happen in desktop computing, where open source software shaped cloud infrastructure, servers, development tools, and even parts of Android itself. There's also a cultural shift happening among younger tech users. Many people growing up today are more aware of surveillance, data ownership, and digital freedom than previous generations. They watched social media platforms harvest personal information, saw subscription models spread everywhere, and experienced how dependent modern life has become on giant tech companies. For some users, Linux phones are becoming symbols of independence and technological self-determination. Owning a Linux phone is not only about specs or features, it is about rejecting the idea that corporations should completely control the digital tools people use every day. That mindset resonates strongly within online tech communities and open source movements worldwide. At the same time, Linux phones still face serious obstacles before they can truly compete with Android and iOS on a large scale. Battery optimization still needs improvement. Camera quality often lags behind flagship devices from Apple or Samsung. App ecosystems remain smaller. Carrier compatibility can sometimes be inconsistent. Many average consumers also prioritize convenience over openness, and mainstream operating systems still provide smoother experiences for most people. But what makes this moment interesting is that Linux phones no longer feel impossible. They feel early. That is a huge difference. Every major technology shift initially looked niche before becoming mainstream. Personal computers, smartphones, streaming services, and even Linux itself followed similar patterns. The next few years could become one of the most important periods in smartphone history. Artificial intelligence, cloud computing, wearable devices, and privacy debates are all reshaping the tech industry at the same time. In that environment, Linux phones offer a radically different vision for the future. A future where users own their devices completely, where software is transparent, where repairability matters, where ecosystems are open, and where communities shape technology instead of only corporations. Whether Linux phones eventually become mainstream or remain a powerful niche movement, their existence is already changing the conversation around mobile technology. Android and iOS may still dominate today, but for the first time in years, they finally have something new to worry about.